so much for spending your lunch with me. It's so exciting to be back, and I'll talk about this, but everything I do today came out of the time I was at Brown. So excited to share my journey, and also sort of my, I've been passionate about climate change and dedicated to this work since I literally signed up to go to Brown. I even checked off the box that I thought I would do environmental studies when I was first back in high school, and got accepted, and I've been doing it since. But my focus for the past decade has really been on emerging economies and how do we address the climate crisis from that perspective. So I wanted to kind of share with you background on that and sort of that part of the climate challenge, and then I can talk more about sort of my journey to where I am today. So, oops.
Oh no.
Oh no, it's not.
It's the slideshow thing.
But this isn't it's not on my computer anymore.
Oh no, we're gonna need an arrow. That's not you, right? That's not.
No, I think it's linked to his computer now.
I'm so sorry. I'll
chat.
Yeah, it's this mess over here.
Sorry, I must have pressed it wrong. So you just hit slideshow up there. Nice. Okay. Yes. So I'll talk more about Odyssey sort of more towards the end once I give a little bit of background, but just so you know what I do. Our mission is to accelerate the clean energy transition in emerging markets. And it's a very big mission. We play one role in doing that, but really the thing that gets us up every day and what we focus on at our company is what can we do to make sure that more renewable energy technologies are being built in Africa and India and Southeast Asia and Latin America as sort of the core energy infrastructure and energy future for these parts of the world. We do that by being a climate tech platform. So we are a financial technology platform. We bring together lots of different stakeholders in the sector to use our technology to deploy capital faster into energy projects. And we do that through sort of a variety of software and other tools. But first, before I talk more about Odyssey, I just kind of want to give you all a sense of the challenge that we're tackling here. So in emerging markets, you have this sort of confluence of two issues. You have energy access, and then you have climate change. So for energy access, there are about 1 billion people in this world that do not have access to electricity. And even more who have some access to electricity, but not reliable access. And it's almost hard to appreciate being in this environment, right? Like you just turn your lights on, you turn your computer on, no big deal. Like that is not the reality for huge parts of the world. So we need to be giving these people access to electricity. Now, obviously that plays a core role in economic development because you can't develop if you don't have access to power and all of the things that need power. But if we were to bring on this population, the 3.5 billion people without reliable access, if we were to bring them into sort of modern day electricity in the way that we did it in the US, greenhouse gas emissions would be up the roof in emerging economies. And so the challenge that we have here is how do we address climate change and bring down emissions while providing the roadmap for economic development and access to electricity in these parts of the world. So this is sort of the big thing that I've been thinking about for a long time, that I'm passionate about, that I'll talk more about this, but when I was 25 years old, a few years out of Brown, I moved to India and started to think about this, and that's sort of been the evolution of the work that I do today. So just to kind of give you a sense of history here and what's different about the US and developed economies versus emerging markets. In the US, our electricity grid looks pretty similar to like how it was designed back in the 1880s. You've got like let's say a big power generation source, let's say a coal-fired power plant or a natural gas plant, that goes into a centralized network of transmission lines. And then those transmission lines go give power out through distribution lines to all power users. So everything is just this big wired network. And And so, that was how it was originally designed. It's been decently reliable for many years, although we're now starting to see sort of some of the shortfalls of that grid. So the first one being it's still primarily fossil fuel based because it is, it's run on originally these really big coal-fired power plants. Now, there's natural gas, and we're starting to integrate large-scale renewables, but it was really designed around that. The second issue that we're starting to see is actually having a centralized grid when you're dealing with the impacts of climate change makes it very unreliable, right? So take California, for example, rolling blackouts. I live in Colorado. We just had to, Xcel, our energy provider, just had to shut down our power for 24 hours because the winds were so high in Colorado and the fire risk, because Colorado's been so dry recently, was so high that they were like, you know what, it's just not safe to be running tons of electricity through all of these lines on a windy day because it's gonna cause these rapid spreading fires, which we had a couple of years ago, and they were really scary. So we're starting to realize oh man, now that climate change impacts are here, having all of our power come through a centralized network of power lines and having our energy sources over here and our users here is actually really not good for reliability and can be frankly pretty dangerous. And then the other challenge is that now that we're so much more aware of the need to decarbonize and to have a much cleaner energy grid, we're sort of retroactively trying to put renewables into the grid. And that's hard too, right? Because you have this grid that needs to be constantly balancing supply and demand and turning things off really quickly. And when you have intermittent renewables, you've got solar that's producing when the sun's shining, you've got wind farms that are going when the wind's blowing. Yes, you have storage, but we need to have storage on a huge scale. It's just really complicated. And so it's hard for us to kind of, this is why we're slow, and fossil fuels are still the biggest source of power in our grid, is because it's hard to retroactively decarbonize the grid and add more renewables into a very legacy kind of old system. So that's a little bit about kind of how we developed our grid and where we are now. Now let's look at these other parts of the world. In emerging markets, I said the 675 million people have no access to power at all. So that just means that they live in areas where there is no grid, right? No one's ever even built a transmission line or distribution line to their part of the world, and it's probably not coming anytime soon because the governments don't have money for this. The distribution companies are often very underfunded. Many of them are bankrupt in most African countries. So they're not waiting for the grid to come. It's unlikely to happen. And most of those are in sub-Saharan Africa. So you can see 587 of the 675 are in Africa. And I don't know if any of you have seen this, but those night light, if you're looking at a satellite image of the world at night, you can just see Africa basically get dark at night. And then some of them are the rest of the sort of populations are in Asia. So that's sort of the challenge. When I was 25, I moved to India and spent the year in rural areas, in communities that didn't have access to electricity, and that was for me how I really came to appreciate what it means to not have access to power. It can be kind of hard to internalize because we've just had it our whole life. So here are some pictures of some villages in, I think that this is in Uganda. But yeah, basically everything stops at night, right? There's kerosene candles, now there's small scale solar lights, but if you don't have power, your kids are not studying at night, you're not doing any sort of economic generating activities that require power. These are very sort of remote, small communities that don't have a lot of economic future until they have a power source. Okay, so enter how we think about energizing these economies now. What is so exciting and unique about the point where we are is we understood how we did it in the US and in Europe, right? And we we understand the pitfalls of that. Now, in emerging economies, because the national grid, the central utility grid, hasn't really been built out, power demand has completely outstripped power supply. So there's lots more people that need power and the grid just hasn't been able to keep up. So that means that we need about $175 trillion of investment in energy infrastructure to meet power demand. So unlike the situation we have in the US where it's like, wow, we invested all of this in our national grid, like we're now trying to like tweak that grid. Here we have this like almost blank slate where it's like, okay, we need to be building renewable energy resources, we need to be building energy infrastructure just to, continue to develop and promote economic development in these countries. But we have the opportunity to do it in a different way than we did it in the US. And that way is all distributed energy. So when I say distributed energy, I mean like, don't worry about a central utility grid and shipping power from here to there. Just put the energy source right next to the entity that's using energy. Best example, take a shopping mall in South Africa. Doesn't have that reliable access to power. Put solar right on the roof, put storage, and they have their own energy source right there, and they keep their lights open even when the energy grid is off. We kind of segment the market for distributed energy in 4 ways. So solar home systems, commercial industrial systems. There's still a role for centralized grid, and then there's mini grids. I've kind of given you the rundown on what the centralized grid is. Solar home systems is the sort of the smallest form of distributed energy. So that is 1 or 2 panels on the roof of a house, of a hut, and probably powering like a cell phone, maybe a couple lights. So very basic power, but still a really important step because at least you have lights on at night. So when I was in India, my work was trying to figure out how we can really sort of get solar home systems into these communities, because it was many years ago now. It was still early in sort of the evolution of distributed energy, and a lot of these communities were rightfully kind of wary of a new energy source, an investment in something they didn't know if it was going to really work or work for a long time. And what's so exciting is now, like, you can't go to a community in India and not see solar home systems. Like, it's just the way that people have power in rural areas. So solar home systems like have been a really important way to introduce distributed energy to these markets. But it's really just a stepping stone because it doesn't power factories, it doesn't power economic activities, it just gives people lights and phones, which are really important, but not enough. So then you enter, that's where mini grids come in. And this is really kind of where I've been working for many, many years. A mini grid is a whole solar plant that is in a community and then will power all of the households and economic activities of that community. So it's basically just its own little power plant. And it has a little distribution network, you don't need transmission or anything because it's all very close, but it'll power 500 homes and all the shops and agriculture activities that are happening. And so that's really been a major development because now these communities actually can like run a grain mill or what we call productive uses of electricity, things that sort of generate income. They have access to power and it operates just like the grid. We're working on a really cool project right now actually in Nigeria to set up a mini grid in a community, power the whole community, but then also provide power to the cell tower that's near the community because there's like 16,000 cell towers. And that provides a sort of anchor use of the energy of the mini grid, and then you can kind of like at a lower cost give electricity to the rest of the community. So that's what a mini grid is. And then the last sort of part of the market is commercial and industrial. So that is a single solar project powering usually like a single, what we call an off-taker, a single shopping mall, a single factory. And that's become a really fast-growing market, particularly in Africa, because for a factory, if you don't have reliable power, if your like machines aren't running, you're losing revenue. Like power is so essential to their core operations that it just makes so much sense for them to invest in a power source right there to make sure that they have reliable power. So those are kind of like the three spaces. I work primarily with mini grids and commercial industrial, a little bit less solar home systems, although we do a little bit of work with that as well. So I guess hopefully you kind of have a sense now for the opportunity or why this makes sense, but there's sort of three things that have come together recently, like I would say even in the past 5 years, that make distributed renewables such a sort of obvious path for electrifying these parts of the world. The first is regulation. So in the US, energy is highly regulated. Basically, utilities are like almost quasi-governmental entities, and we were just saying that like Brown built a 100 megawatt solar plant and got it off the ground in 5 years, which is like a huge accomplishment. I mean, it takes so long to get projects off the ground because they're so tightly regulated. In emerging economies, they've completely shifted the regulation so that any private company can become a power producer because there's such a need for power. The utility companies are not supplying it, and so they're really opening up the market. And in South Africa, they deregulated everything under 100 megawatts, saying like, if you want to just go build like a couple megawatt power plant, go do it. And so that's really sort of opened up a whole new framework of thinking about energy, which is that it can, rather than have everything be centrally controlled, you can have a lot of companies that are going and building these, and that's very much been taking off. The second thing is just that the unit economics now make a ton of sense. So the cost of solar has come down so much, the cost of storage has come down. It's usually actually the cheapest option for a company if they're looking to power, to have reliable power to go put solar on their roof. And that's actually something that's a little bit different in emerging markets versus the US as well, where usually when you're putting like solar on the roof of a building, you're trying to like optimize a little bit of savings from the grid. Like you probably have reliable power from the grid, but you can like, during peak times, like shave off a little bit of the cost of electricity. Whereas in emerging markets, like your alternative is like shutting your doors, right? Not running your factory. And so you're losing a ton of money. And so the unit economics just make a ton of sense to like make sure that you have a reliable power source, especially because the cost of solar has come down so much. And this is happening like on a micro level too. So in the past 3 months, we sourced solar panels as part of our work. The cost of solar panels have come down 36% just in 3 months. It's insane. Like, and that's a little bit of a fluke, but still like just the rate of production has completely changed the cost profile of these. And then there's just a sort of a growing market of entities that are all sort of now engaging this because of this opportunity. And so the competition in the market has also sort of made things more efficient, brought down the pricing, made financing more available. And so we're looking at this like incredible time and opportunity for distributed renewables. I just got back on Friday from 6 weeks in South Africa, so I thought I could just kind of paint a picture of what this looks like on the ground. So this is Cape Town. This is a picture of a commercial industrial project right outside Cape Town. In Cape Town, the central utility Eskom has basically just not been able to keep up with the development of the economy, and there's far more power demand than there is power supply. And so Eskom has instituted these, what they call load shedding, which is basically rolling blackouts that happen up to 5 times a day. And so you can imagine just like how frustrating it is to live in South Africa. If your power is constantly shutting off, how hard it is to be a business trying to operate. And so the distributed renewables market has just like completely taken off. And all of those 3 things that I just talked through are happening. So you see they've deregulated the market and made it much easier for for the private sector to go build power. And they've also made it, in addition to building power and basically like putting it on the roof of a factory, they've made it possible for private sector actors to go build power, send it into the existing grid and do what they call wheeling, which is like use the existing grid to then send the power to somebody else. So if you have like a space constraint, you can put the power plant somewhere, borrow the grid to send the electrons to the person that you're like building the site for. So that's been a really cool innovation. And as I mentioned, like the costs of solar have come down so much. I mean, we were just talking to some distributors of panels and batteries, and it's just amazing to see how cheap they're able to, like the low cost per kilowatt hour, megawatt hour that they're selling at. And yeah, like tons of activity in the market. I mean, every company that used to do like, was an electrician or used to do any sort of construction is now all building renewables. It's just like, it's just so cool. Everywhere you look, there's a solar plant being set up. So yeah, so that's all the really good news. Now the challenge is that nothing is happening as fast as it should be or as fast as it needs to be. So the UN set a target for access to modern, reliable electricity for the entire population by 2030. It's called it's the Sustainable Development Goal 7. We are like so far, I mean, you just saw the numbers, we're still 675 million people away from that. And so I mean, there's lots of reasons, but when I was sort of stepping back and trying to figure out the role I could play in this, we identified sort of three key things that were holding back distributed renewables from like really just moving at the pace that we need them to. The most important one is finance. It's still hard to get these projects financed. There's a lot of challenges with international financiers trying to put money into these economies. Case in point, a lot of the work I do is in Nigeria. If you're building a mini grid, let's say in Nigeria, your customers are going to be paying you in local currency Naira, but you're buying your equipment in dollars because that's the currency that the Chinese manufacturers take. The price of the Naira collapsed 90%. So like just a month ago. So like literally just went off a cliff. And so basically all of your revenue source went down 90%, and that's the revenue that's going to be paying back the investment you made in dollars. That's really hard for a financier to like give you a loan, right? Because then they don't have the assurance that you're actually ever going to be able to repay that loan. So that's sort of some of the challenges that go into getting finance. The other challenge with finance is this is like an entirely new type of asset. Like there are plenty of infrastructure funds that know how to put money into a 300 megawatt power plant, right? It takes a long time. They throw a bunch of millions of bucks just into the process of financing that asset, but like that's the way it's done. Most of these institutions are not set up to figure out how to put like huge amounts of money into many, many small projects. Because these are like 100 kilowatt, 500 kilowatt systems. Like you have big portfolios of them. You might have like 100, 200, 300 projects. But like how do you take $50 million and then put it into all of these little systems and make sure that your money is going to the right place and these systems are performing and you're going to get paid back? So that's been a major challenge. The second challenge is just procurement. Like I mentioned that every mom and pop shop now is doing solar, but they're all really small and subscale. And so they don't have any sort of economies of scale in their buying, and so they're often needing to purchase equipment at a much higher price than they otherwise should be, or like at a much higher price than what the manufacturers are producing the equipment at. And related to these is this just concept like how do you manage a portfolio of like thousands of systems? Like how do you make sure if you're an operator of solar systems, it's one thing to go operate a huge power plant, right? You've got like a whole team. This job is just like make sure that power plant is still running. But now you're like that same team is needing to make sure that 1,000 power plants are still running. Like how do you do that? That's a challenge, and you will completely bust your budget if you're sending people out to every single site. You need to like manually check what's going on. So that enter Odyssey. That's sort of the challenges that we're addressing. We designed the platform to basically bring together all of the stakeholders or the key stakeholders in the sector to use technology in a way that they can kind of like tackle these problems that I just set up. So the sort of core of the platform is for financiers. So anyone who's looking to put money into distributed solar in emerging markets. Those financiers are working with solar companies that are building these projects and installing them. And then equipment manufacturers are selling their equipment to those solar companies. And so Odyssey basically is a place where all of them come to engage with each other and interact more efficiently. just a little bit about kind of like where we are. We've got, a few 1,600 solar systems kind of under management being monitored by our platform. We've deployed through our platform 2.3 million solar systems, so that's pretty cool. That translates into about 15 million people whose lives have actually been changed because we brought power to them. And because we sort of bring financiers to the platform, we have about 1.6 billion of capital that's been made available to the market. And the way that we do this is through basically 4 modules in the platform. So we think about providing technology for planning solar systems, financing them, getting them built or procuring your equipment, and then operating them. So in the planning phase, we have a whole set of tools to make sure that the project is really rigorously analyzed and planned in a very systematic way. Because 80% of these projects often fail just at this stage because there isn't a systematic way to make sure that this project is going to sort of like take off. Then we have a whole set of tools for bringing together financiers and solar companies and using our technology to engage with one another in again, a very systematic way so that you don't kind of like start from scratch every single time your financier is looking at a project. It enables financiers to look at big portfolios of projects rather than like each individual power plant. So to give an example of what that looks like, in Nigeria, the government of Nigeria and the World Bank was a $350 million program, and now they're launching a next one that's going to be about $1 billion. And they are funding. They need to track every single solar system that is financed through with their money. So like they're putting $1 billion in, but that's going to go to like millions and millions of small systems. Our technology basically makes it possible for them to know what's happening. So they're working across hundreds of companies, they're working across millions of systems, and every single piece of that data is tracked in the platform so that they can just log in and be like, okay, cool, I can see 1 million projects are operating in these regions of the country, and they've produced this many kilowatt hours yesterday, and this many are still functioning, these ones are having problems. It's just incredible what you can do with sort of the cloud-based data technologies now. And we do this by both kind of providing workflows in the platform for all the companies that are engaging with this financing to self-report data, but then also we plug directly into the systems, and actually that's what this operate piece is. We plug directly into the solar system, pull data from the system itself, and then reflect that data, so we can see at any given second really like what's happening on this energy system. Is power flowing from the battery? Is it flowing from the PV? Is it providing reliable power? Is there a problem with any of the components? It's really incredible what you can kind of do remotely now with solar systems. And then the last piece that I skipped over, but the build section is we have a procurement platform where we actually aggregate equipment orders, get better pricing for procurement, and we offer our own financing to installers of solar systems to give them kind of working capital solutions they need to get projects off the ground. So that's what we do. I thought I would just kind of finish by sharing my journey since Brown. I've very much been focused on this for quite a long time, and I was kind of like reflecting, just being here today, how much everything I did at Brown just sort of like led to where I am now. So I wrote my thesis like literally here in the Watson building, like spent so many hours, and my thesis was on oil drilling in the Amazon. And I remember I did a call from here with like an interview subject for my thesis, and he was building a team to basically do work related to what I was writing my thesis on. And so he said like, hey, I'm actually, good timing, like I'm building this team, you should come work for me after you graduate. So literally like from writing my thesis, got a job on Wall Street. So it's a firm called Risk Metrics, and did that for 3 years. We were analyzing how climate policy would impact the portfolios of big institutional investors. This was back when there was sort of we thought imminent climate legislation in the Senate, and so a lot of sort of big investors were thinking about, okay, if there's a carbon price in the U.S., how will that impact my investment? So I was doing that analysis, so did that for 3 years, and then I attended a lecture. I was living in New York at the time, obviously, because I was on Wall Street. I attended a lecture of the head of the IPCC, who is based in India, and he was talking about this program that he was running called Lighting a Billion Lives, which was a solar lights initiative in India to really get sort of small scale solar into rural areas of India that didn't have access to electricity. And for me, like hearing that lecture just kind of clicked that I already knew I was passionate about climate. I've been looking at like US climate policy for 3 years, but I was also really passionate about economic development, and I'd spent a lot of time at Brown also studying that. And so like this concept of bringing solar to emerging economies and rural communities and emerging economies was just like the perfect confluence of everything that I was passionate about. And so I realized like, oh, this is like where I want to go next, and this is also like the piece of the climate puzzle that I really want to play, because it just brings so many of my interests together, and also it's just so critical, right? Like 100% of the greenhouse gas emissions growth is going to happen in emerging economies, and we have to figure out how to put them on an economic development path that's low carbon. So I did a Fulbright, moved to India, studied distributed solar, spent an incredible year like out in all of these rural communities, really understanding the challenge of introducing solar to these parts of the world. Came back from that, I did a joint policy and business degree at the Kennedy School, at Harvard Kennedy School for Policy and Business at Stanford. Really cool program if anyone's thinking about doing like a hybrid grad program at some point, because just two like very different worlds that you get to straddle, and otherwise it would be 2 years at each school, but you can do you do it across 3 years. So you get a ton of exposure to a lot of different disciplines. And during that time, I still was like focused on climate. I was still focused on climate policy. Still focused on emerging markets, but when I went to business school, I started to think more about entrepreneurship and like how I could play, or how entrepreneurship could play a role in sort of crafting these solutions that were needed. So so then I had a little bit like I made this like extra windy between grad school and my next job, because I had like convinced myself that I needed to go into management consulting after business school, because I had this insecurity that I hadn't had like a traditional career. I like had gone to Brown and then immediately gone and like worked in the thing that I was most passionate about, which was climate. And then done this another thing I was really passionate about with my Fulbright. And so I just had this like fear that I'd really missed out on some like just core like professional training. And I remember like when I got to business school, there were all of these people that had like gone into banking or they'd gone into management consulting, and they were like really good at Excel, and I was not good at Excel. And I felt really inadequate, and I was like, oh, I have to go into management consulting and get good at Excel. So I did a summer internship in management consulting. I'd signed up to go back, was planning on sort of doing that after business school. And I walked into the office of an adjunct professor at Stanford, and I was just gonna have like a general chat with her, because she'd been an incredible climate, her name's Kathy Zoy. She was in Obama's administration working on energy and climate. She ran Al Gore's nonprofit around climate, and had done a lot of things in between. So I was just like really curious to hear about how does she straddle policy and the private sector. But when I walked in, she was like, she said, oh, it's like so great you're here. I just took this job as CEO to go launch a company to build solar mini grids in India and Africa. Like, you have experience in this, come do this with me. And so I totally had this like course correct moment where I like reneged my management consulting contract. They didn't care. Started working with her like the next day. And turns out I actually, like, one of the first things I had to do was build a Excel model. So I learned how to build Excel through that. But yeah, we spent a lot of time on the ground in India and Africa building solar mini grids and learning about how hard it is and all of the sort of things that needed to happen to make this scale. And from that experience, we realized like, hey, there's a technology platform that's really needed by the whole sector here. Like, let's go build that. And so when we left SunEdison, we started to build Odyssey and launched that in 2018 or so. And so been working on that since. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to share that journey because A, it all started here, and like one thing has led to the next, and B, like as you are all thinking about what you do after Brown, I just would encourage you to like, you don't need to wait, you don't need to like go do something else and get skills and then work on climate. I got all those skills in some way or another, but like I've been working on this problem since day one, and we don't have any time to waste. We have zero time. We're way behind. We have negative time. So like, if this is your calling, like just go work on it as soon as you can and do whatever you can, because we just like need the brightest minds fixing this this global challenge that we face.
Amen.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Listen, I'm gonna open the floor up to Q&A in just a moment. And actually, if you're near a mic, everyone just push the button up to 1 in front of you. That way we won't have to worry about whether the mics are on or not, because apparently this event is in fact being both recorded and live streamed to the internet, where I'm sure we have an audience of 65 million or so. To give people, I'd love to let the first question be from an undergraduate student. So I'm going to encourage all of you to think about a question, and to give you a moment to do that, I'm going to ask a question of Emily just about competition and cooperation within the industry. And so one thing that struck me is that as you're thinking about this really important task of setting up mini grids, and you might have, say, 300, 500 different little projects going on. I can imagine, many of those are going to succeed. Some of those are going to fail. They're not going to financially perform in the future. And as a company, you might feel quite proprietary about the information around, which ones failed, et cetera. But from a climate solutions perspective, we want the industry that you're now in to learn and to hopefully drive that sort of success ratio upwards over time, right? And so, can you just speak a little bit to how you think about being both a policy person and a business person, and how the sort of competitive and cooperative push and pull shapes the way you approach this problem?
That's such a good question. It's something we actually think about all the time, because we have all the data in our platform across all the, like literally every single mini grid in Nigeria that's being built is in our platform and producing data. And so we get asked all the time to share it, and we're always trying to like straddle the line, because the companies that built it, it is their proprietary data. They don't want to share their data with other companies. That said, they all do agree that like in order to move the industry forward, we need to be learning learning from failures, learning from successes. So the way that we've basically found is most successful is when you tie like data and reporting to financing to something that these mini grid developers like really need. And so they did that a little bit with this first program we launched. Now this next $1 billion program, they're saying like, in order to get money from us, you have to tie your system into Odyssey, and you have to like show us the performance and allow us to do analytics. And we'll never say like this company and this mini grid is doing XYZ, but you have to allow us to anonymize it, because sharing data is like so important for moving the sector forward. So that's been, I think, probably a really interesting development in the market. And then industry associations are also really helpful there, because industry associations can be a place where competitors are also like coming together and then pushing forward industry initiatives. And so they'll often collect data and report it out, but do so in a way that companies like feel like their data is being protected.
So now I'm going to betray my real ignorance. This may be a stupid question, but is there an industry association? Like, what's the industry association that you would be a part of with that Odyssey?
Yeah, there's a few. Yeah, there's an African Mini Grid Developers Association. Okay. It's pretty new. So that's specifically for mini grids. And then there's like Africa Solar Initiative.
Terrific. Yeah. Terrific. So please let me turn the floor open. And if you want to give your name, please do so.
Sure. My name is McConnell, and I was wondering, are there any lessons for U.S. energy policy that come out of this? I'm especially interested in like the potential for energy deregulation and the reforming the permitting process for large energy projects.
Yeah, it's a good question. I have to admit, I'm like a little bit ignorant about U.S. I've been thinking about emerging markets for so long. I get asked questions about the U.S. solar market all the time and don't know that much about it. But I would say, generally, kind of like distributed energy is also happening here in a big way. And some of the things that emerging markets are doing, we're like now seeing translated here. For example, these really integrated solutions where it's not like you have one company that's providing the monitoring for your system and another company that's doing the financing. Like having like an end-to-end solution for companies that are trying to get distributed solar off the ground here is starting to happen in a big way, and it's almost like a learning from how it's happened in emerging markets. But yeah, I don't know a ton about what's happening on the I don't know a ton about like the regulation of distributed energy here.
Can I just piggyback a little bit, and forgive me for doing this, but just to emphasize that, you know, in the US, I think it is not just a technical problem anymore. In fact, I think it's not even primarily a technical problem anymore. It is mostly a problem of the kinds of issues and questions that the social sciences are focused on. Social acceptance, institutional reform, you know, all of the sort of software that makes an energy system work. And so, that is not to say that there's no engineering challenges. There always are, and there's always ways to improve. But I think that is one of the lessons that we see sort of all over the world, and is true here in the US.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so cool. Like, anyone is installing solar in these markets. Like, there's no question about the technology. It makes sense. It's known.
Yeah.
It's not hard anymore. Yeah. It really is all about the other things: the policy, the financing, the capacity building.
Yeah, great. See your question, please.
I am not an undergraduate. In fact, I have known Emily, I don't know, it's a long time now, since 2003 or something. So I have two technology-based questions. And one, they have to do with development of mini-grids. So when you develop solar, it actually requires carbon to build it. So there's a big carbon investment in that. And so one question is Odyssey and are your procurers, is your community ecosystem thinking about how to start sinking carbon, like stripping carbon as part of this process, because the technology exists to do that? It seems like you could couple that. The second question has to do with storage. So Morocco is building an enormous salt storage system and plans to export energy to England, of all places. Yeah. But South Africa is next to Namibia. I mean, these are countries with a lot of solar, and so I'm wondering about whether Odyssey is investing in storage, because my concern from the environmental side is the proliferation of solar systems and wind systems that you wouldn't need necessarily if we could store energy.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, and that's a carbon problem.
Yeah. Well, so on the carbon, sort of the supply chain impacts. Carbon, it's like what keeps me up at night, because we don't do a good job looking at like sort of the full carbon impact of our mini grids. Like even in our platform, when we show carbon emissions avoided to all the funders and everyone, like, you know, all these development banks want to show that they've avoided all these emissions. We just take the kilowatt hours that are being produced and multiply it by a factor that say, what if these kilowatt hours were being produced by diesel generator, which is the alternative to these systems, and then you get your carbon emissions, and that's not taking into account any emissions that went into putting that plant in place. So we don't do a good job there. Storage, though, is
so that's an important question, a NEPA question for the United States too. I mean, it's a question that doesn't get asked with this offshore wind powers. What about these cables? I mean, we're building these enormous facilities, and we don't ask about the carbon cost of doing that.
Totally. Okay. Yeah, I know. And I mean, there's not even great methodologies for coming up with avoided emissions, even not taking into account that. But then when you bring the full life cycle emissions into play, like it's hard. But we should be doing more on it, because it will certainly reduce the impact that we think we're having with these systems. I think they're still net positive. I mean, it's way better than building out a fossil fuel based distribution network. But yeah, storage though is very much like when I say distributed energy, it's solar plus storage or storage alone. Yeah, so that's a huge piece. Because actually, here's a great story. When I was just in South Africa, I was visiting a friend's house, and I asked him like, oh, you know, there's all this load shedding. Have you put solar on your roof? And he said, actually, I realized like I don't need solar. I just put a battery. I have an extra battery for my laptop, a couple extra batteries for like the most important appliances, and when there's load shedding, like I just rely on those batteries, and it was working fine for him. So when you have in South Africa, which has like at least a more developed grid, even though it's having major issues, you can kind of use storage a lot. That does not work in for mini grids where you're like at an area where there's no grid, so there's nothing to charge your battery. You need the solar to charge your battery.
So I have an eye on the clock, and we are running out of time. But I want to maybe collect a couple of questions, and then you can answer the pieces that you can quickly. So we'll start with Rich, if you want to.
I'm not an undergrad either, but I'm an undergrad, and it's great to see you back. In fact, I signed your undergraduate thesis for a number of years.
Yeah. No.
Yes. Okay. Boomerang effect.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Wow.
I seem to remember you had an interesting health challenge in Ecuador, is my recollection.
Oh yes,
But
yeah. I got my appendicitis when I was doing my thesis research in rural Ecuador, and got my appendix out in a local clinic.
Oh my God.
Where they just cut me open and pulled it out.
They had electricity though.
Yes.
Well, it's great to see you back after so much time. Anyway, the question I had, any thoughts or reflections on the role of government, public sector, in the countries that you've worked in the energy transition? So, in hearing what you presented today, I might come away and think, well, government is part of the problem. National government should deregulate, get out of the way, and things will move more quickly. But then we hear about the government of Nigeria presumably getting the World Bank funding that then is used to purchase services like those provided by your company. And I know you've worked and visited lots of places. So what are your thoughts on the role of, some sort of political scientists, on the role of the state and the public sector in all of this?
Let's just get one more question. Yeah, please. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Caroline. I'm a graduate student here, so also not an undergrad, and I'm South African. So it's pretty unusual for me to have South Africa held up in a positive way when we're talking about electricity. But I guess, and I think a lot of what you've said is resonates with me. You know, my partner, we have solar on our roof. Everyone has that. It's solar's on all the shopping centers, all of that. But I think that in the South African case, at least, I think that it doesn't solve all of the problems, right? Distributed solar, distributed renewables. So one of the things is that I think there is still an important thing to be said about the transmission grid. And in South Africa, where we have the biggest potential for solar and wind is where we don't have grid capacity, because it's in a different place from where the fossil fuels came from, right? And I'm not sure that I buy that distributed solar is going to solve all of those problems. And I also think that it does sometimes there's a complicated politics maybe that comes from this. So for example, most of the people who are putting solar are people who can afford to put solar, right, on their grids. That also means that there's now no revenue going to the municipalities who previously provided for the electricity, and often was cross-subsidizing poorer households to have cheap or free electricity.
Yeah.
So that is a very complicated political situation that results from what appears to be a very clear, sort of technical solution to load shedding, which is a problem. And then the other thing with that is also, in a country like South Africa, which is, as you say, different from other parts of Africa, it does have a relatively developed grid with problems. I mean, South Africa is the 14th highest emitter of coal, of fossil fuel emissions, I think, in the world, right? So this is not like Malawi or Uganda or whatever. Is that you have a just transition problem, right? That you have to account for the fact that there are entire communities that are built around coal, right? Coal production. So how do you see that? And there are people who are talking about solar as kind of transition there. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on both the kind of the sort of local level politics in municipalities and then also the kind of just transition question.
Yeah. I mean, these two questions are related, right? Because the government is the most important actor in all of this. So when I'm saying deregulation, I don't mean government get out of the way. It's actually that they've figured out that they needed to change the whole framework in the way energy is funded, in the way energy is supplied, and who can do it to create better options. And so South Africa's done that. Nigeria has done a good job with that. But yeah, there's a lot more to figure out. So subsidies of solar for low income, Nigeria, that's what I mentioned, what we're doing a lot of in Nigeria, that's really critical, because if you're just saying if you can afford a solar system, great, now you don't have this load shedding problem, but if you can't, you're in trouble. Obviously that's not gonna work. So I don't think anyone thinks that there isn't a role for the grid either. It's very much part of the solution. It's just that at least South Africa has created a role for alternative solutions, Whereas in a lot of other African countries, the governments have still just continued to say the only entities that can provide power are utilities that are doing a really bad job at it. And then you have even more of a economic disparity because if they're just not even building electricity to your community. But yeah, it's much more complicated than just like, cool, put solar up on your roof and you're good.
I think we might have time for one more question. And I saw Matthias. Why don't you go? Go ahead.
I'm curious how you see the role of China in all this politically to create a market for their goods, their technology providers and providers similar solutions, EPC companies, project developers, financiers, and so on.
Yeah, it's insane. We only talked, like my team spends all day, every day talking to Chinese companies. And we do projects for the U.S.
As suppliers or as
suppliers of panels and batteries, and inverters. So we do work for the U.S. Trade Department, USTDA, Trade and Development Agency, and like their whole goal is to get like U.S. suppliers in these markets, and they ask us to go find U.S. suppliers that can compete as part of these projects, and we never can find any. It's just China's market. It's really crazy. Someone was asking me earlier today, like I'm actually not seeing a ton of Chinese like finance coming in. That's still coming from international entities. It's coming from the U.S. It's coming from Europe, but all of the manufacturing is coming from China.
Well, I think we are at time. I have many more questions for Emily, but I'm going to have to sit on them. And so thank you so much for taking the time. I should add that the fact that there are this many people in the room is a huge compliment to you, Emily, because at this time of the semester, there are not very many people who are willing and able to show up. So.